Good evening. Welcome to our lecture tonight. My name is Peter Casarella from Duke Divinity School and Executive Director of Fons Vitae. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Theology, Medicine, and Culture, represented here by Farr Curlin, Warren Kinghorn, and especially thank Troy Cassine for all his hard work he put in making this event possible. It's also fitting that we're meeting on a day in which the lectionary has gospel readings speaking of the cleansing of a leper. So just a word about Fons Vitae before I get to the important matter of our speaker tonight. Fons Vitae promotes Catholic intellectual tradition since 2023 at Duke University, and this year we initiated, with the support of the Templeton Foundation, a monthly Catholic Medical Humanities program for 12 undergrads from Duke and from UNC. And Dr. John Thorpe, who is the leader of that program, I'm proud to say, is with us this evening. And looking to the future, we seek to build bridges between faith and reason, not just in the Divinity School, which has graciously housed us, but across the many different professional schools. I met today with Rich Eva, the philosopher who works in engineering ethics at Duke. And our speaker today will draw upon Catholic social teaching, which is a core part of our mission, disseminating Catholic intellectual traditions here at Duke. But now to the important matter of our distinguished speaker. Dr. Abraham Nussbaum, MD, is a physician and writer in Denver, Colorado. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, where he directs mind and behavior course for all first-year medical students. He works clinically at Denver Health, an academic safety net system, on its adult inpatient psychiatry units, where he's chief education officer, and he provides a strategic vision, daily direction, and administrative oversight to that body. His most recent book, Progress Notes, 1 Year in the Future of Medicine, was published by Hopkins Press in 2024 and tells the story of 7 medical students in an experimental curriculum and a medical educator determined to chart a better future for medicine. Importantly, he's an MTS graduate of Duke Divinity School, and someone said to me in the hallway, he was TMC before there was TMC. He is here as a faculty research associate with the help of the McDonald Agape Foundation. He's preparing his next book, One Snake for Medicine, on gift economies in medicine. And nothing Catholic at Duke transpires outside of the shadow of Coach K, so I'll conclude by noting that Abraham and his family attend Blessed Sacrament in Denver, where he's varsity girls basketball coach. His talk this evening is Where the Pale Rider Takes Us, How Solidarity and Subsidiarity Point the Way to University's Post-Pandemic Future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abraham.
Hey, can you hear me in the back? Volume's good. Are you okay if I walk a little bit? I like to walk and talk, and I like to interact with folks. Can you hear me? No, you cannot hear me. Give me a second. Let's make sure this mic's on. The mic is on.
Yeah, it works when you touched it. So
the mic is on. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. How's it now? Testing now. Better. Should I sing? Nope. We're gonna get there. Okay. Troy. Where do you want it? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I really appreciate the invitation. I am usually a pretty comfortable public speaker, but this one's hard for me because I don't normally get invited to talk about theology. I have only a master's degree, and it's been a long time, and many of the people in this room taught me in various ways and are truly my betters as theologians. So please forgive me. This is an opportunity and an exercise. I hope I do okay. I hope along the way you'll feel free to interact with me. I am going to talk about the pandemic, which is a difficult thing to talk about, and I'm going to take some controversial stands, and I hope that you'll enter into them and discuss them with me. I had kind of thought about not talking about that and talking about Catholic basketball, because I am a Catholic basketball coach. I'm missing my daughter's game. They beat Assumption last night. They lost to Good Shepherd the night before, and this is the great thing about Catholic basketball is it's a little bit like living in a medieval village. I told Peter this at lunch. We yell things like staunch, most precious blood, block the Immaculate Conception, and chain up St. Peter and St. Paul. These are actual things we yell. And the St. Therese team, their chant is "Little flower, give us power." So these are deeply inside Catholic. But tonight I'm actually talking about the pandemic. And I'm going to talk about that in my lifetime, not in my lifetime, sorry. In the last 110 years, 3 of the 7 most deadly pandemics in human history have occurred. And I want to talk about what's happened with them, what we can learn from them, and how Catholic social teaching might help us to make some sense of them. And I want to talk in particular about a very odd experience I had. So when we entered the pandemic, I am a psychiatrist, but I'm also a member of our hospital's executive staff, and we began meeting twice a day thinking about how we were going to respond as a society to a pandemic. And I want to be crystal clear. There is nothing good about a pandemic. Pandemics cost people's lives, they disrupt their lives, it's a horrible thing. And yet, there was something clarifying and strangely wonderful about practicing medicine in a hospital during the pandemic. Anybody care to say what that might be? Solidarity. Martha, why? Why was there solidarity?
There was a sense that you had trained up for this and now it was there and you do it together.
Yeah. And if I may, there was also a sense that some of the bureaucracy, some of the hierarchy fell away, and we were focusing on exactly the thing that mattered. We would have conversations. I particularly work in education, and so we think about residents and trainees, and we'd have trainees where people would say, we think we can send the nephrologist to the internal medicine floor. And that's silly for those of you in medicine because, of course, nephrologists are all trained internal medicine doctors. But there was also a freeing moment when we said, where are the people in need and how can we send the people with skills to them? Does that make sense? So nothing's good about a pandemic, but that got me thinking about solidarity. And Professor Casarella invited me to talk to Fons Vitae, and it gave me a chance to think about this and to answer the call of Pope Leo XIV, who's invited us to think about how the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition can help us think about seemingly intractable problems. I'm not asking you to read everything he's written here, but just to observe that he's saying that there can be a dialogue between science and conscience, that we can pursue hope and peace. We have a specific anthropological approach as Catholics. There can be genuine engagement. And we're called to build a culture of encounter through dialogue and social friendship. Whatever your politics, whatever your persuasions, I imagine that you can agree with me that we need more culture of encounter and more dialogue today. And we need more hope and peace. And so I'm going to offer this as an exercise in responding to what the Pope said. And importantly, what he's saying is not that the cloche, it doesn't say, he said it does not claim to possess a monopoly on truth, right? When social concessions are concerned, the question is about how we approach them. And as Catholics, we do that through something called Catholic social teaching. And for those of you who don't know it, if you look up on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, they'll tell you that there are these 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. And you can see I'm an academic physician, so I use PowerPoint, but you can read these here. Things like option for the poor and vulnerable, dignity of work, solidarity, rights, responsibilities, care for God's creation, life and dignity of a person, call to family and community participation. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, right? It's a tough thing to teach because it doesn't really do that. So for most of us, we think that there are 3 cornerstones of Catholic social teaching. And we think that they're primarily human dignity, this idea that every person, even me, is made in God's image. We believe in this question of solidarity, that we're one human family, and we're responsible for each other's well-beings despite our differences. Even though I root for the right shade of blue, Professor Casarella roots for the darker shade of blue, we are still human beings together. Then also subsidiarity, which I think is a really important term that maybe is a little bit less known than solidarity, which is this idea that when possible, decisions should be made at the most local level possible, okay? And with larger entities stepping in only when necessary. So, I work at Denver Health. Does anybody know what Denver Health is? Dr. Baker, what's Denver Health?
Denver Health is the health system, and it serves the public. It's a public health system.
Yeah, it's a public health system in Denver. People know us. We like to tell people that we have a hospital in downtown Denver. We're one hospital system, which is a rarity. But we also have 20 federally qualified health centers. We provide all of the care at the city's jails. We provide all of the care. If you ever come to Colorado for a concert and go to Red Rocks and you have trouble, we'll be there because that's actually part of Denver. Winter Park is also part of Denver. That's why it's called Winter Park, because it's owned by the city and county of Denver. We provide that care, all the care at the jails, etc. Oh, and all the schools in Denver have a Denver Health Clinic in them. So we're a system. About half of our patients have Medicaid, and most of the rest of them have some other form of public insurance. And so we're a place that thinks about solidarity a lot. So, but meanwhile, I'm going to talk specifically about some of the things about being a physician, but I also want to talk about the broader question of what's happening in the university, because I think it applies. And I want to start by telling you a story about my good friend. I have this amazing friend. He's a wonderful human being, much better human being than I am. His name's Joshua T.B. Williams. And I love that his middle initials are TB, because he's a doctor who cares about infectious disease. And in particular, he's a community pediatrician who went to the University of Chicago, very smart young man, went to Wheaton as an undergrad, and he has become a researcher. And he is a very successful researcher, and he has what's called a K Award, which is a big deal in academic medicine. And he's won several prizes, and he's on track. He's a young guy. He's about 10 years younger than me, and he's on track to a great research career. And then something happened, which is happening to researchers and scientists throughout the country, which is this. The White House stops a flu shot study. So the news of the day is this: what's happening between the university and medicine, and the university and the federal government. So this is a picture of Josh, Dr. Williams, and Josh was doing things like he did the nation's largest study of the question about how religion affected COVID vaccine rate studies. He did this paper identifying some racist guidance in this vaccine study, and he had a K Award to do a question about vaccine hesitancy among communities using narrative medicine. And when the current administration took over the federal government, I think they did Control F and they canceled his project. And he was 2 years into a 5-year project, and he'd gone out and recruited a series of community members to partner with him. He was heartbroken, both for himself and the career he built, but also for the community members that he made promises to work with. And Josh did something that really surprised me. One is he said, I'm going to finish the work. Even though it's a 5-year project, I'm going to figure out how to finish it this summer if you'll buy me some time. So I bought him some time. And then when we negotiated with the federal government to get his grant reinstated and we threatened to sue them, they said yes. And Josh said, I don't want it. I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. I want to do other work with people who want to do this. So just while I was here, Josh joined this study that we do about vaccine safety is under threat by the federal government. And Josh had been appointed to a big federal group that studies vaccine safety. His appointment started December 28th, and on, I think, January 10th, they canceled him. This lovely person. And these kinds of things are happening across the university. My guess is each of you knows someone whose career, life, and work has been challenged by this moment. It's an odd thing to have come out of the pandemic. This is a picture of me with a COVID selfie. Back in the early days when we didn't have masks and we were wearing masks handmade by people. I know, I don't look good at all. I don't usually look good at all, but I see you grimacing back there, right? This is what it felt like working in the hospital. There was solidarity, but it was hard work, right? And in that moment, I would have been very surprised if you had told me that we were going to be canceling all the vaccines. In that moment, what we were waiting for was to say we're going to work hard until the vaccine comes. Remember this? That's what we were saying to each other. It would not have been what I would thought we would wind up doing. But what I want to talk to you tonight about is how pandemics drive change. And I believe we're still living in this pandemic. And you don't know how they're going to change you until years later. And that pandemics crown surprising winners and losers. And it can seem, as it often seems to researchers like Josh, that it feels arbitrary, impossible, and not sure what to do in this moment. And I'd like to make a small offer that Catholic social teaching can help us understand this moment. So, I told you that the three of the 7 most deadly pandemics in human history have occurred in the last 120 years, and I'd like to talk to you about each of the 3. The first one is H1N1. Does anybody know, what do people know about H1N1? Tell me something about H1N1. Please.
Is that the swine flu?
No, but close. Starts with an S. We think of Spanish flu, sometimes people call it, or influenza. Anybody else? The biggest thing is, imagine, as tough as our moment is, imagine how difficult this moment was, right? This happened right after World War I, and it especially affected young people, right? It's really important to remember that the Spanish flu killed young people. So, this is a picture. So people didn't know how to fight it, and they didn't have any treatments. So this is a picture of people outside of a rubber factory in Denver, and they were doing calisthenics to ward off influenza, right? We're going to do this. We're going to fight the flu. And ironically, they're all standing next to each other, breathing hard during a respiratory.
Apart.
Pardon me?
They're 6 feet apart.
They're 6 feet apart, almost, yeah. So in the pandemic, in the COVID pandemic, when we were all quarantined and at home, there were listicles, which is a horrible term of art portmanteau, right? And recommending books to read about the pandemic. And some of them people said you should go back and read books about the Spanish flu. Does anybody know this book? Anybody read this book? What's it about, Dr. Baker?
It's almost the only short story or novel I can think of from 1918 flu. There really weren't many. And it is a story set of flu in Colorado, I believe.
In Colorado.
And not a real fast-moving story, so I don't
Maybe he's not recommending that you go home and read it. But it did win the National Book Award in the 1940s. And part of why I called this talk Pale Horse, Pale Rider is that this woman, I told you that the Spanish flu especially affected young people, right? This woman was a 23-year-old society reporter, whatever counted as society in 1918 in Denver, Colorado. And she would report about going-ons and operas and art shows. And she had a boyfriend on the outskirts of town at an army base because he was a young man being called up to World War I. And he got sick and she got sick and they called for an ambulance. And the ambulance took them to Denver Health. And she fell asleep and into a coma. And when she woke up, her hair had gone white and it never went back. She had phlebitis and her arm was so frail, right, that it broke. She walked the rest of her life with a cane. Her boyfriend was dead. She said, illness changed me in ways that I couldn't imagine. And she said, as I fell in and out of sleep, the pale rider kept moving on the pale horse, killing person after person. She wrote this book called Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And she talks about this. The body is a curious monster, no place to live in. How could anyone feel at home? Anyone who's been serious sick can know what that is like, for the body to feel like a curious monster. Part of what interests me, practicing at that hospital where Pale Horse, Pale Rider was based, is the way that she describes the medical care that she was given there. And in particular, she says that she was given lard, onion juice, and plasters. Dr. Odo, future Dr. Odo, is that the kind of treatment we're giving people today?
About 1/3 of that we still use.
Yeah, fair enough. Only 1/3 of that, right? But we don't give lard, mustard, plasters, and onion juice anymore. Why not? Because pandemics crown winners and losers. And one of the things that H1N1 crowned as a winner was the idea that medicine should be tied to the research university. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. I apologize, Dr. Baker. But briefly, one of the things we're going to talk about is that before the H1N1 flu, there was a move among progressive era reformers around the turn of the century and just past that to change medicine. And in particular, they said medicine at that time required even less schooling than I got. A medicine could be an unlettered apprenticeship. You could become a physician just by graduating high school and then apprenticing to somebody. And in its best case scenario, it was a short college degree. So Oliver Wendell Holmes' father was the dean of the School of Harvard Medicine, and Harvard Medicine in the mid-19th century was a 2-year degree. The first year and the second year were the same. They were repeats of each other. 2 years. So for those of you who are residents in the room or physicians, think about that. You could be done, you could even go to college and med school and be done at 24. Yes! You could still have your hair when you're finished. Okay? So they said, look, we need to think about medicine being longer. It needs to not be community-based apprenticeship. It needs to be at research universities. And it needs to require excellence in the research scientists, but importantly, without similar rigor for the humanities. Earlier this week, we talked about what the TMC is and what it could be. And one of the things I'll just say to spoil my punchline is to ask that similar rigor for people, not just in the research scientists, but also in the humanities. And it was made possible by those Eros monopolists. Vanderbilt endowed Columbia, Payne endowed Cornell, and Johns Hopkins gave his name to a school called Johns Hopkins, which we'll talk about. And in 1907, the American Medical Association went and visited every med school and declared that they were either acceptable, doubtful, or unacceptable. Those three terms. Those were the terms. Okay? And the model for this was a man named William Osler. Does anybody know Osler? right? The older heads do. They know Osler. When I went to med school, the cafe was named the Osler Cafe, right? This is him down here in the front with the sweet mustache. And he said that to become a doctor, you need a college degree and knowledge of several sciences, biology, chemistry, and physics. Anybody who's done the pre-med curriculum, you can thank William Osler for it because it's still the same pre-med curriculum, minus the foreign languages. And if you go to a traditional medical school, the first 2 years are preclinical and in a room like this with a guy like me talking to you like this, right? First year is about the normal body, second year is about the diseased body, and then the next 2 years is a clinical tour of the various specialties, all tied to the research university. With me so far? Okay, that's the model Osler had. And if you look at pictures of Osler of the time, this is my favorite of him. It's a picture of him, and he is described as this kind of saint above Johns Hopkins Hospital with infectious diseases fleeing, and he's dressed up in these kind of angel wings with that sweet mustache sprouting out above him. Who else is in the picture with him? Nobody. He's alone, right? He's the doctor above it all. And in particular, he argued that medicine should be about having equanimity, right? Being the kind of person who's able to see difficult things and not be disturbed by them. That was the core virtue for a physician. In 1908, after that AMA report, a guy named Abraham Flexner was hired to visit every school in the United States and Canada. He spent as little as a half day at some of them, and he looked at all those med schools and he said which ones should stay and which ones should open. And in Colorado, there's a typo in my slides here. Colorado is the centennial state. It was founded in 1876. 1876, we're a young state in comparison to North Carolina, the home of the nation's first public university. 1876 is when we're founded, but even then, 24 years later, we had 5 med schools in the state. That's how many med schools there were in the country, and they were here. And he writes that the patients at my hospital should be transferred from the Gross Medical School, that's what it was called, Gross Medical College, and his evaluation of the schools was basically, are they a research university or not? And he said it was plainly against the general interest of the community. And he said nationwide, only 1 out of every 5 med schools should stay in business. The rest should be put out of business. This is what you can see, this is the entire report about Denver. It's 1 page, right? And this is the phrase, plainly against the general interest of the community. But if you read the report, the general interest of the community seems to be a good cadaver lab, a research library, and a bacteriological lab. Okay, so a decade after the report, this drove change. And my argument to you is that part of why it drove change is because of the flu. So in 1920, only 85 schools remained. In 1930, only 76. And in Colorado, we went from 5 med schools to 1. Then there were philanthropy was directed to the elite institutions, and in doing so, who became a doctor changed radically. There were more black men, physicians in the United States per capita in the late 19th century than there are today. We've never recovered. There were more women physicians per capita in the United States in the late 19th century until the 1990s. And part of it's because Osler said the only schools that should stay open is those that can do a research university. To be clear, I love the research university and I love the basic sciences. I teach them to medical students. But when you say medical education is going to require 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, and it costs a ton of money, you wind up narrowing very quickly who can attend and go through medical school. Does that make sense? So they did. And for most of the 20th century, 80% of all the black doctors in the United States trained at only 2 schools. Okay? This all changed. The greatest historian of medical education is a guy named Kenneth Lutimer, and he charts out what's happened to the research university, right? He says, look, by the 1940s, this is inflation-adjusted budgets. Budget of a medical school was $1 million, and they were focused on education. By 1960, it was $20 million, and they were focused on research. And by 1990, it was already $200 million. They were focused on being regional health systems. The model of care changed, and the model of what schools were about, what happened to research universities. And to be clear, I'm a physician. It enriched physicians. This is a chart of the median salary of public school teachers in the 1970s when I was born. I know that was a long time ago, but that's when I was born. And this is teachers, and this is physicians, academic psychiatrists. And you can see what's happened to our comparative studies. I like being a physician. I love being a physician. Teachers are important too. And it's not at all clear to me that we should have this level of growing gap between teachers and psychiatrists. Okay? Meanwhile, Littlemer's hasn't written a book in a couple years, so in the AAMC, we now say MD granting schools revenue is $210 billion. And where does most of that money come from? If you look at the NIH and you take the next 39 largest grantors of money for scientific research and combine them all together, they are less than the NIH. A partnership has developed between the federal government and the academics. In the 1990s, when I moved here to work for Stanley Harawas as his research assistant, Stanley used to say that if you want to know what the modern research university is about, he would say, look at an aerial map. And he'd say it was about medicine and the athletics. And if you look at the Duke University master plan that I looked up last week from December 2020, right, athletics, medical center, and everything else is West Campus, Central Campus, East Campus. Right? That's what drives the growth of this campus, is where are the athletic facilities, right, and where's the medical center? Okay, pandemic number one. I'm making an argument to you that it catalyzed the idea that we should build up research universities and that they should be the gateway to things like medicine. Pandemic number two. This is one I do remember. This is a picture from June 1983 in Denver. I was only 8 years old at that point, but this is a famous event from the National Lesbian and Gay Health Conference where they drafted what they call the Denver Principles for Patient Self-Empowerment. And I'm going to make an argument to you that the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which was the shadow of my own medical training, was primarily focused around this question of engaging marginalized communities. It was the signal event for the physicians of my generation and the generation 10 years before me. Does that make sense? Would you agree? That was kind of the big question of learning about HIV/AIDS. So in my generation, the biggest play was probably something like Angels in America by Tony Kushner, right? And the leading physician on some level was maybe Abraham Verghese' My Own Country, book that I read while applying to med school and was very moving to me at the time. And then the terrific Duke alum and Catholic Paul Farmer. In some ways, if Osler was the model for that previous generation, in some real way, Paul Farmer was for this generation. Okay? And if you look at what people learned from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, I would argue that they learned several things, but they learned both implicit and explicit lessons. The first implicit lesson, we showed you this picture of this idea of self-empowerment by gay and lesbian people, right? And this idea of engaging marginalized communities. One of the big lessons that academic medicine and the university learned is that it should have some engagement with marginalized communities as a kind of solidarity. The next thing, though, that they learned was that funded research could really advance medicine. This idea that you could take HIV/AIDS, which was killing so many people, and turn it into a chronic disease was a gigantic revelation to medicine at the time. Does that make sense? It also meant that then we would push the pharmaceutical industry to treat chronic diseases. If you go back and look in the 1970s, ID departments were dying on the vine. People weren't going into ID. All of a sudden, ID became the most interesting and hot field in medicine. Right? That generation of people, if you think about it, those are the people who were leading academic medicine when COVID hit. What did Dr. Fauci cut his teeth on? As an HIV/AIDS researcher, right? All of these people came up in that era. Does that make sense? Does that resonate for you? Okay. But there's an implicit message too, which I don't think people like to talk about in medical centers, which is that this growing wealth gap that I showed you between academic medicine and other people in their community was starting to separate physicians from the same communities they said that they were going into it to serve. There wound up being these political, religious, and financial shifts that ultimately advanced the inequalities that physicians were saying they were setting out to go. Brett's not here. This is the part of the talk Brett likes. He's not here for me. And so if you look at this amazing book by a Duke alum, Therese Lassau, great person. I met her through Stanley when she was here. I read her dissertation. It's a beautiful dissertation. She wrote this lovely book about Paul Farmer. And when he came to Carolina, when I was a med student, he gave the Merriman lecture. He talked about medicine as a personal encounter between a physician and their patients, especially marginalized patients, that extended life-extending advances in modern medicine to people living in the world's poorest places. And he called it pragmatic solidarity. It was inspiring to me then. It's inspiring to me now. I'm amazed by the work that he did. And he was especially good at saying we should practice the corporal works of mercy. right? He cited Pope John Paul II and Britney Spears in the same talk, which was unusual at the Med Center at the time. It was fun and cool. And if you look at a book, though, like this, and if you look at his own works, and if you look at the index, solidarity is discussed 106 times, but subsidiarity only twice. And I want you to just reflect on that, and I'll come back to you and explain why I think that's important. So what did we learn from HIV/AIDS? One thing we learned is in a book like this, if you look at that whole generation of what people learned, they learned that one of the things you want to do is have a relationship with a marginalized community and pay attention to them. You want to think about how you can research it through a research university, and you want to think about how you can partner with the pharmaceutical industry to deliver life-saving research. Does that make sense? So I published a book with Yale University Press, and right before the pandemic, they sent me a book to look at and maybe blurb, and it was this book. And I read this book right as before COVID came out. Anybody read this book? It was a surprise bestseller because normally big doorstop books about epidemics in society don't sell well unless they're released right as a pandemic hits. Frank Snowden wrote this book that was based on a class he'd been teaching for years at Yale about epidemics in society, and he wrote, "Epidemics afflict societies through the specific vulnerabilities people have created by their relationships with the environment, the other species, and each other," which is true, but also the kind of thing that people said after they'd gone through the HIV/AIDS crisis, because it was that particular attention. If you think about where academic medicine was at a time, this is just a quick and dirty PubMed search about the phrase social determinants of health. And if you look at how quickly that phrase had grown from 2000 to 2026, it's this gigantic upcrease. It was hard to publish a paper in academic medicine in 2019 and not think about social determinants of health. Does that make sense? It was hard to have a paper that didn't do that. And so in my world in academic medicine, the expectation was, if you read this book, he ends the book, and the reason why it sold so well is in part because, I forgot this part, he ends the book saying, we're this close to the next respiratory pandemic. And it was like, oh man, good job, buddy. Horrible that happened, but good job that you knew that and published a book about that. So when the pandemic hit, all the people that I knew in Denver Health and the University of Colorado and throughout most of academic medicine thought, this is the moment we've been waiting for the version of solidarity that we thought we had in the HIV/AIDS crisis, and we're building with our society. Does that make sense? They thought that's what was going to be the result of the pandemic, is that we were going to finally enshrine this question of that kind of medicine. But meanwhile, in the background, if you were listening, there was this bubbling undercurrent about how we were losing trust between medicine and society and the academy and society. And I pointed out that you can see it in a book like this, Dope Sick. Dealers, doctors, and the drug company that addicted America. I don't like, as a doctor, to be put after the dealers. I don't want to be in the same sentence, right? Like, I don't want a patient to think of me as a drug dealer. And yet, people were, because there was this concern that we were actually drug dealers, right? When I was at Carolina, I had an amazing education. We were being taught that pain was the fifth vital sign, right? We were being told that on rounds. And now we realize that in part that was, in fact, the result of our saying medicine should be tied to pharmaceutical companies, right? And that interest. And there were these concerns people were having before the pandemic. We were thinking about this. People out in the community were saying, the university is too expensive and closed to me. Inequities bother me. Why is it that that teacher salaries can't buy a house and doctors can? There was a political realignment of physicians. There's a great paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. I can't remember if it's New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA, showing how in this era, at the start of this, the majority of physicians are registered Republicans, and at the end, the majority are registered Democrats. However you feel about that, it's just this realignment that was happening, rising burnout among clinicians, and there was this diminished trust between academic medicine and communities. That was true for medicine, but also true more broadly with the university. And then COVID hit. This is a picture from my hospital, somebody gowned up in the hospital. And you know it's later in the pandemic because he's got a respirator. And during the first months of the pandemic, first month, in a weird way, it felt clarifying and purposeful because we were focused entirely on the question about how do we save lives and save our community, and we were concerned that the Spanish flu would break out again. And I want to be clear, I'm going to register some concerns about the way medicine handled COVID. I'm not talking about March, right? In March, people didn't know exactly what was happening, and it was time to figure out and save lives. So we boarded up restaurants in Denver. We probably did this too in Durham. And there was an artist named Coco Bayer who we pasted hearts over it. And she put these words, hope or esperanza, right? And they came up all over town. That was encouraging. When I would bike to the hospital, right, there would be wolf calls when I'd be biking home. People would put yellow ribbons around trees. And at our hospital, the mask that I showed you I was wearing, I'm in charge of our emergency medicine residency as the DIO, and one of the mothers of the emergency medicine resident made 1,000 masks for us because we couldn't get masks. And Crocs is based about 30 minutes north of Denver, and they came up and they said, we've got Crocs for everybody. We gave out Crocs to residents. And there was restaurants that closed down and they'd bring food. All of these were signs of material solidarity. Does that make sense? And it felt like, oh my goodness, I've been doing this work for decades where I'm taking care of sick people and people don't realize what's actually going on. And in this moment, people are recognizing what's going on. And they're seeing how hard it is to risk your life, because it felt that way when we were first doing it, and thanking us. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's not a great picture. It's done on a cell phone. This is a story from my wife's practice. You know my wife. Some of you other also know my wife. She runs a family medicine residency at a Catholic hospital in Denver, and they couldn't get N95s. A lot of people couldn't, and they were worried, and they had a patient who called them up and said, I've been worried about this. She's like, I know, you're an anxious person. He's like, I know, you've been treating me for generalized anxiety disorder. But I've been monitoring the reports out of China since December, and I started stockpiling N95s. Swear to God this is true. And said, I've got a bunch, do you have enough? And she's like, how many do you have? He's like, I need 100 for myself, but I've got more. So on Easter morning, members of her faculty stood here, and he's like, I won't touch you though, because I'm anxious, and I'm afraid for a respiratory pandemic, but I'll throw them out of my window. So he threw out all these, you can see these bags here, trash bags full of N95s. Swear to God, it's true, right? This is a moment of solidarity. It was also a reminder that we had invested in the wrong things, right? So, meanwhile, we started to see murals like this in Denver. Why did we have a mural like this? Who does this look like? What picture did I show you earlier? Osler. And it's this idea that physicians are heroes, right? Or nurses, or whatever this person is, it's unclear. And we're weirdly fighting a disease now, right? But weirdly also alone again. And we started to put up signs like this, and this is where I wish Brett was here. These are all good signs about social distancing, but notice that they say wash your hands, right? Brett talks to me about this, about how in public health we don't always say we're going to do something together. I want you to wash your hands, right? These were signs of social distancing. And this is one that Denver put out. Walk, bike, or run, maintain social distancing. But people started to ask, who can maintain this kind of distance? I ride my bike to work. Not everybody can. Not everybody can afford to. Some people are unhoused. Some people are in jail. They can't afford this kind of social distancing, right? These are, no offense, they're bros, right? This guy's bro. He's in Colorado. He's got some tattoos on his arm. They got bikes. They're wearing homemade bandanas. It's well-intentioned, but it's forgetting this question about where actually people are in their lives. And meanwhile, counter-protests started to break out. This is from early in the pandemic. People were saying, we want to be free, we want to prioritize personal autonomy. You can see they've got a USA t-shirt, and it says land of the free, and a healthcare worker standing in front of them and saying, please, don't do this. And you can see this kind of cultural resonance of where we wound up, and the moment of solidarity was over. But it was over when we started to talk about social distancing. Does anybody know where the phrase social distancing comes from? It started out as a scale by sociologists. And sociologists were asking, what level of difference will you and I tolerate? Will you be with somebody who is the same race, religion, class as you? And they measured it, right? These are the people. And this is their language from the original paper, right? Same employment, citizenship, visitors, what rank you'll get. We took an inverse measure of solidarity and used it to describe what we were doing. Okay? So then, meanwhile, Josh, my friend Josh, whose career just got canceled by the federal government, was doing these maps about where COVID was affecting people. In Denver, we call this the inverted L, where I-25 and I-70 come together. And we say that most of the social determinants of health map outside the inverted L, right? And we could see that COVID mapped onto social, economic, and racial inequalities. And there's the MMWR report. You can't find it anymore. All those reports have been canceled by the federal government. They've been pulled from their website. That's what it was. And so we went from this moment of solidarity and alliance And then I felt like pretty quickly we had this downward spiraling COVID response. I don't know what it's like in North Carolina, but this was my experience. We went from alliance to anxiety to anger to anguish, and it was bad. And all of a sudden, nothing was fun about this. And people would post, this was things people would show. They'd say, look, this is how society happens. You have emotional lows and highs and trigger events, and there's a pre-disaster, there's a warning threat, and there's a heroism, and people put signs of hope on the wall, and they paint pictures of you as a hero with wings, and then there's a honeymoon, and then an inventory, and things go bad. But then there's a reconstruction and a new beginning, and it only happens after a year. We literally showed this in incident command at the hospital. We're like, we're gonna get there, right? We're gonna get here, it's gonna be tough, we'll get the vaccine back, and everything's gonna be great. Did it happen? Has society gotten great again? Sorry, it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like we've healed. So meanwhile, the CDC started reporting that all of those gains that we had by doing academic medicine in the Osler style were reversed. A whole century of gains on life expectancy were reversed by COVID. And then you started to get, in the last year, pages like this in the New York Times. The end of the university as we know it. With me so far? Okay, it's getting dark, but they're getting some hope in there somewhere. Why did this happen? I think that there's a ton of opportunities to criticize everything that happened from an inconsistent federal government response that, among other things, platformed non-evidence-based interventions, cast doubt on people, and criticized and castigated people in public health. I've got no time for it, I'm not here for it. But as a physician, I want to look at my own house and the House of Academic Medicine. And I think there are some things that we did wrong. This is an example of one of those things. Do you remember this paper? This was the first endorsement of a president by the New England Journal of Medicine. It was signed by the editors, not by an individual author. And they wrote, instead of relying on expertise, the administration has turned to uninformed opinion leaders and charlatans who obscure the truth and facilitate the promulgation of outright lies. I happen to agree with that on some level, but I would never have written it this way and with this tone, because they didn't acknowledge how medicine had for a century not thought about the general interest of the community. And they didn't acknowledge the role that we in the medicine and the university broadly have played in losing the trust of our communities. It's hard for us to argue that we'd spent the last 100 years truly building trust with community, right? And most recently, I gave a version of this talk at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in November, which was interesting. But one of the things I talked about is that I've had the chance to read all of these books about COVID postmortems. Only the ones that are interesting. And one of the things that's interesting is that most of the people who are on the political left and part of institutional medicine all have one thing in common with them. Can you tell me what's in common about these books, about these titles?
Conflict.
Yeah, lessons from the COVID war, silent invasion, World War C, science under siege. I told you that I came here to work for Stanley Hauerwas, and that he told me that the university, you could take an aerial view, and you'd see that it's about the medical center and about hospitals. Stanley also taught me to be careful about war metaphors, right? And to worry about when people are talking a war metaphor, part of what they're telling you is that you've got to pick sides, and my side's the right size. And they're saying that we're not going to have rational discussion. Now, before the pandemic, I had actually written and thought about this a little bit. Farr and I have both debated the same person who's written about conscience in ways that I think we both find limited, one might say impoverished. And I had done a public debate with her. And I had argued to her that there were alternatives to war within medicine. And that you could, instead of having conflict, you could think about conscientious, right, objection. And I had written this paper about how there were alternatives to having war metaphors. And these are all from this amazing book, Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle, with a super 90s cover, right? It's like there. And he says, look, these are alternatives: non-compliance, non-conformity, non-intercourse, non-obedience, non-violence. We did not allow and encourage that kind of communication with COVID, and we're still not with our communities. So what happened post-pandemic? This is a map from the New York Times of federal researching for development in 2023. The bubbles are, purple is private, this kind of pinkish color up here is public, and the size is how much money goes to them. What do you notice about this map? What, Dr. Carlo?
Just the Northeast.
The Northeast? Other things?
Product is nothing.
We get nothing. We get a little bit, but more importantly, it looks a lot like the inverse of the electoral map. This is the electoral map. And there's lots of things about this electoral map that look like this to me.
Yeah.
But one of them is this question about where is there trust between the version of the university that we're all in some ways a product of and where people voted. Right? This is the same New York Times, it's the same map. And you can see what I mean, that they're pretty much similar. So if you read What Went Wrong, this is one of the better COVID books, I think. One of the things he says is that in the United States, COVID drove us further apart, according to most Americans. I don't know if you would agree with that. I think most Americans might, that the experience of COVID is not one that brought us together as a society. That moment of solidarity was pretty short. Does that make sense? That's at least my argument. And then when I say that we're still living in a pandemic, I don't mean that we're at the height of peak COVID. Otherwise, I would not be here in this social gathering. I mean that we're still living out the effects of COVID. And one possibility is that we will become an increasingly polarized society. And on my darkest days, I think that's where we're heading. I worry about that. But I think there's some opportunities, and I want to get to those. This is from a paper in Health Affairs, and it shows, I think, some interesting data. And what this shows is this question of Republicans, how often people were voters, right, and COVID deaths. And this question of who was dying. And what's interesting to me and to other commentators is that if you look in the early pandemic, right, it's pretty equal to roughly what part of who's dying. And it turns out that actually a lot of the states that were governed by Republicans and chose a different path around non-pharmaceutical interventions had pretty similar death outcomes to those that chose pretty strict NPIs. This is where I get a little controversial. But after, as the pandemic expanded, it flipped. And there was tremendous death rates in states that had largely Republicans. Okay? I'm trying not to talk about politics. I promise I'm going to bring this home to theological points. And I want to show you this graph. This graph is when vaccines become available, right? This is pre-vaccines. This is Republican vote share and COVID deaths. And what's fascinating is that there really isn't a gigantic difference in the way that different states governed and how much people were likely to die by COVID. But there was a huge difference once you went to this question of vaccines. This is part of why it's baffling to me that the lesson that we've learned from this pandemic is to cast doubt on vaccines. So I want to make an argument to you, and this is where I'm going to go full Catholic, I'm going to go full papist for you, that if you think about Catholicism and Catholic social teaching as a way to think about social problems that can't otherwise have a solution, in the early part of the pandemic, it was important to think more about subsidiarity, and in the later part of the pandemic, it was more important to think about solidarity. Let me explain what I mean. I believe that when I read the Pale Horse, Pale Rider, I see a medicine that we had for only a fleeting moment during COVID, and that medicine is solidarity. What does solidarity mean? Awesome, right? Anybody else? Any other definitions people want to offer of solidarity? This is a Catholic definition. It comes from this word Latin, solidus, meaning solid, firm, whole, or entire, right? And this Pope John Paul II said there's a firm and preserving determination to commit oneself to the common good for all of us, right? And the sort of foundation in Catholic social teaching for solidarity comes from Leo XIII in 1891, and he's responding to a similarly polarized time where there's a fight between industrialization's going on and capitalism's going on, and society's changing rapidly. And he wants to emphasize the dignity and rights of workers. He was concerned with worker exploitation, poverty, inequality, and illness, and access to critical care services, including medical care, vaccines, and sanitation. And it laid the ground for Pope Paul VI's 1967 document, Populorum Progressio. We are the heirs of earlier generations, and we reap benefits from the efforts of our contemporaries. We are under obligation to all men. Therefore, we cannot disregard the welfare of those who will come after us to increase the human family. The reality of human solidarity brings us not only benefits, but obligations. Mutual solidarity, social justice, and universal charity. That's the Catholic definition of solidarity. It's a long document. Every line is worth reading. Please do. The second medicine that I think we neglected is subsidiarity. And this develops out of the church's response to German National Socialism and Soviet communism and American capitalist ideology. It comes from the Latin word subsidium, meaning to sit behind and assist only when needed, right? And the idea is that higher entities should provide help, or subsidium, right, only when smaller groups, families, communities cannot handle tasks themselves. So it preserves individual dignity, local initiative, and prevents excessive state power. It's a balance between individualism, right, and collectivism. It's meant to mediate between those two things, right? And the classic document is here from Pope Pius XI. When we were in the hospital, twice a day, we would look at dashboards like this. And I was with Mike Cohen last night, and he was saying, Mike's an interesting guy. He's an immunologist. He probably taught you at Carolina. Did he stomp on the bagel?
I don't remember that.
He's a worldwide expert about HIV/AIDS, and a guy deeply formed with that aversion and has done a lot of stuff with COVID. And Mike says, we hated the dashboards. We told the hospitals not to do it. And I was like, in the hospital, we were doing the dashboards. And we were looking at dashboards like this all the time. And we were looking at number of cases, doses administered, people hospitalized. This is it. These are all really important things. Let's be clear. I think these are really important things. But they don't measure any other community goods. And I believe that all of our lives have goods beyond, are you hospitalized or not? Are you vaccinated or not? And the problem with looking at these every day, twice a day for 2 years is that we neglected those things. It's an example of solidarity to ask, are people hospitalized? But we weren't paying enough attention to the common good, right? We weren't thinking about what are the other social goods beside this. This is another dashboard from the Colorado Department of Health, Public Health and Environment. Again, awesome thing. It's looking at immunization rates. But it's an example of solidarity without sufficient attention to subsidiarity. We weren't asking how they got them. Okay, why do Catholics care about vaccines? Catholics have a history with vaccines. Pope Benedict XIV was inoculated against smallpox. Pope Pius VII led the first vaccine mandate by a sovereign state in human history. And in 2021, both Pope Francis and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI were two of the first leaders to receive the COVID vaccine. Francis called it a simple yet profound way to care for one another, especially the most vulnerable. And in 2024, Pope Francis appointed Cataline Carico to the Pontifical Academy for Life. Do you remember who this person was? Anybody? She's fascinating. If you want to go back and read one of the weirdest stories of COVID, this is a brilliant researcher who invented the chemistry for mRNA vaccines. And she was at Penn, and they were going to fire her because she didn't have any research grants. And then all of a sudden, she was like the biggest person in the world. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do remember now.
Yeah, and Penn's like, oh no, we got a job for you. And she's like, no, I'm out. Like, thanks a lot, right? It was like, maybe you're like, dude, lady was killing it. She was a really good researcher. She came up with mRNA vaccines. So the church was maintaining that vaccination should remain voluntary and emphasizing the responsibility for the act to common good. And the goal was to respect conscience while encouraging collective responsibility. That's a Catholic approach. That's what came out from the Pope. So early in the pandemic, there was a difference that surprised people. This was from the Pew Research Center. And it said, who's most likely to get vaccinated? And it turns out it was Latino Catholics, right? Had very high vaccination rates, right? So Latino Catholics, here they were, right? And atheists, but they're a very small part of the population. And so if you remember, there were early outbreaks in worship service and choir practices, and the AMA said you shouldn't do in-person religious service attendance, and there were some initial partnerships. This is a picture of a priest getting vaccinated. Pope Francis was calling vaccination an act of love. He says we can build social and political love. However you feel about Pope Francis, that's a very Catholic thing to say, social and political love, right? Through small individual gestures capable of transforming and improving societies. And he made appeals onto the common good and made available on a voluntary basis. So this is from the Archdiocese of Manila. This is from Costa Rica, and it's a story about more than 180 Catholic parishes hosting vaccination events. This is my moment to just pause and say, I have a terrific research assistant who's been helping me recently, Brandon Odo, who helped me especially with these last several slides. Let's take a look at two outliers and look at their responses, and then I'll bring this home. This is a story from the New York Times back in September, which got me thinking about this, and it said, look, America's weird in lots of good and bad ways, and one of them is that we're turning against vaccines. And he says, we're a global outlier. The rest of the world has done it. If you look at the United States and read books like Snowden, it tells you America was the most prepared country in the world for a big respiratory pandemic. But when it happened, we're 4% of the world's population, and we experienced 20% of the world's COVID deaths. We had invested in the wrong kind of medicine, right? Let's look at Vietnam. They initially tried coercive measures. They didn't work, so they made vaccination voluntary, and they advanced subsidiarity by intentionally partnering with religious communities, including Catholics. So this is the Archbishop, who was the head of the Catholic conference there, and he talks about this question of supporting medical research centers, cooperating with authorities, and helping out. And he called the faithful to contribute to a fund making vaccines available to all, which is fitting because his Episcopal slogan means, may they be one. There were stories of Dominican nuns helping out during the pandemic. This is a group of Dominican nuns preparing gifts for the homeless and the unemployed, creating a free market during the pandemic, right? And they were specifically calling out Luke 10, Romans 12, right? That we need to work for our neighbors, rejoice with those who weep, rejoice with those who droop, weep with those who weep. And that the goal was to not exclude anybody and to infect people, right? These are other stories. Vietnamese nuns, okay, they did use a marital metaphor here, go to war with COVID. Catholic doctors and associations helping the Vietnamese population, all of these stories. And this is the statement that, one of the statements they made later in the pandemic about all of the things they're doing to help different cities as they help out. So if you look at Vietnam, it has 11 million cases, but only 43,000 deaths. 92% of the people received the vaccine. It is a society that rebuilt trust out of this pandemic, whereas we have become more polarized. And my argument to you is that they did it, in part, by not only focusing on solidarity, but a real solidarity, and also subsidiarity. And it meant that they were willing to partner with the government authorities. This is a story about the success they had, that the authorities praised Catholics for helping out. My favorite thing is that, and they even gave them back some of their land that they'd stolen previously. If only the British would do that. Sorry. So what might the university learn from Vietnam? I have told you a story that in many respects is about academic medicine, because that's what I know best. But I also hope that you'll see that it's a story about how pandemics change society, and you don't know how until it takes sometimes 20 years later. And in this moment, we can decide that what we're going to learn out of this pandemic is to be further polarized. Or, I believe that we can take examples like Vietnam and the partnership it made with the Catholic Church and the government to increase subsidiarity and solidarity and work together. I believe that because the university, in my mind, is facing an existential threat in this moment, because the university in the United States has made so much of its relationship, so much of its growth out of its relationship with the federal government, and that's changing, right? It's a big moment. There's a story in the New York Times today about how now there's only one American university that's one of the top 10 universities in the world. That's changed in the last 5 years. I think it's an opportunity for us to think again about solidarity and subsidiarity and truly pursuing the general interest of the community, partnering across difference, and I believe you can, like Vietnam did, rebuild institutional norms, social trust, and social cohesion. And I believe this because Pope Leo XIV, who's taken his name in part because Pope Leo XIII authored this first flush of the Catholic social tradition, Rerum Novae, but also after Pope Leo I. He was the first pope to articulate the central role of human dignity, and he energized charitable works in a Rome beset by famine, an influx of refugees and poverty, and famously, as barbarians swept across the Roman Empire, he convinced Attila the Hun not to take Rome. And we too can convince the barbarians not to take Rome. And he wrote this. Will you read this for us? Front line, top line for Pope Leo XIV.
We must rediscover, emphasize, and cultivate our duty to countering temptations that can also be found in the ecclesiastical circles. He also stated we must commit ourselves to counter and listen to the poor, who are a treasure for the church and for humanity.
Our Pope, right? And will you read the next one for us?
Sure. Catholic education can be a beacon, not a nostalgic refuge, but a laboratory of discernment, ideological innovation, and prophetic witness. Drawing new maps of hope, this is the urgency of the mandate.
Next line.
I ask educational communities, disarm words, raise your eyes, and safeguard the heart. Disarm words because education does not advance with polemics. but with meekness that knows how to listen.
This is the invitation for Pope Leo XIV. An invitation that I've tried to answer just in a small way by speaking with you today about the ways that pandemics change society and how there is an opportunity to use an analysis from Catholic social teaching to think about how to advance the good, right, through doing these things together. I love that it's entitled Drawing New Maps of Hope, and I hope that's something we can do together. I thank you for your time, and I invite any questions you've got.
We have plenty of time for questions. I'll let you take your own questions. We have microphones for the people in the audience.
Dr. Baker. Uh-oh. A medical historian.
Yeah, we're not going to get into that. It's okay.
Okay.
I mean, I do think a lot of things you're talking about are often unmasked by pandemics, not caused by pandemics. It's a complicated dynamic, but it gets you don't want to give people a 200-page talk. But I think what I really like about what you've done here is how you brought out the themes of solidarity and subsidiarity. But one thing that's going through my head, and I was on a church's committee. We changed our name several times. It's basically the COVID committee, when you open up again. Many people, medical people, use solidarity as the reason not to open up. Solidarity with the vulnerable, solidarity with people who get sick. And sometimes at a later stage, it was kind of solidarity with the healthcare workers who are all getting burned out. And it feels to me like a really important point, too, that I'm not quite sure it's can be totally put into solidarity and subsidiarity, is that medicine or health is not the only social good. I'm thinking that one of the big blind spots I think we had as doctors is thinking about the schools are so important. The schools stayed closed for so long. As a pediatrician myself, that I just saw such harm, mental health harm happening because the schools stayed closed so long. So it's kind of a comment, but I think it's another layer to your analysis.
You drawing it out because I'm trying to be cautious because there's certain discourses I don't want to participate into because I don't think they're helpful and I don't agree with them. And I want to be cautious to say I love doctors, I love academic medicine, I love the research university, but we made mistakes. And one of them is that we had an account of solidarity that didn't take into account the common good and subsidiarity. And when the question became, because the question we were asking ourselves in the first 3 months of COVID is, how do we prevent the hospital from being overrun? That was the question, because we were saying, look what's happening in Italy, look what's happening in New York. That's an important question. It's an important question. There was the fear was that we'd be burying people in the streets. So it's one thing to say, I'm not saying in the first couple months of COVID, I get why we did that. 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, a year in, post-vaccine, when we knew the infection disease pattern, and we were still closing schools, that was on us. And it was an impoverished vision of solidarity that didn't take into account the common good. And we all saw harm of it, and we're still seeing harm of it. Right? There was so much harm by saying, because the Spanish flu affected especially young people. It became clear relatively quick into COVID that it was not affecting young people. I've told this story before, but my son loved COVID because he was 17 and he's like, teachers aren't asking me to do any school. I'm playing basketball all day with my friends and I'm delivering Chinese food and everybody wants to tip hubby. He made $20,000, right? Like he loved it. But it was also like, I'm not sure this is the right move for you. I think you need to go back to school. Your butt needs to be in a classroom. Does that make sense? So I guess I would say part of what I'm trying to draw out here, Dr. Baker, is that one of the lessons we learned about a version of solidarity in the HIV/AIDS epidemic didn't fully account for the common good, and it didn't fully account for subsidiarity. And I think that's what I'm hoping we can learn from Vietnam, and because there will be other respiratory pandemics, and that we can do this differently. And I'm trying to offer Catholic social teaching as a way to balance those three things. Please.
I'm still forming it. But I think,
I can, but they're recording it, and so they want you to speak into a microphone if you're willing.
There's a lot of different examples of, the Catholic Church stepping up in pandemics, thinking about the Black Plague, thinking about the practice of incubation, thinking about even the ministries that Paul Farmer did, as you mentioned. And I think there's like a level of courage that is required to be, to stand up to that level of solidarity, especially thinking about, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, of people being willing to participate in pragmatic solidarity, to be present, to touch, to hold, to be in the same space. And I think one thing you mentioned in your talk was even that patient who gave you the N95s and the anxiety around that. And so I'm wondering how you might see Catholic social teaching or ways to intervene in society that gives people the courage to be with people who are different on that social distancing scale, people who may not find themselves in community with people who are very different from them or who they have different preconceived conceptions of. And that's my own assumptions, thinking about how we see that polarization happening with folks who are not willing to be in community with other people for fear out of harming themselves or others. Does that make sense?
It does. Thanks so much for the question. There's plenty of times when the Catholic Church and individual Catholics, especially me, have made plenty of mistakes. So I'm not saying the Catholic Church is always perfect in this regard. If you're asking me what's an example of that, the one that I remember the most from my childhood is the time when Pope John Paul II was almost assassinated. And he went and forgave the man who did so, right? And I think if you can do even that, gosh, talk about a difference that's hard to come by, right? No one would fault you for not wanting to be friends with or forgive the person who tried to kill you, right? That's the ultimate social distance on some level. And I guess I would say that my experience of at least the published writings of the Catholic social teaching is that it's a constant invitation into thinking about breaking down difference and to loving your neighbor. And so one thing I'd say is just read it. I show those encyclicals because I hope you'll think about reading them, right? I think there's a question in the back. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Dr. Nussbaum. First off, as a Vietnamese Catholic American, really appreciate the Vietnamese Catholic Church being featured at a Duke presentation. It's always nice whenever we get something right.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the Vietnamese Catholic Church.
Yeah, me too. So I guess I was thinking about what you said and maybe also what was left unsaid about subsidiarity, solidarity, and how various institutions responded and doctors responded. And you want solidarity to be pretty expansive, solidarity for the common good, not just like solidarity on the deathbed, perhaps. But I guess it seems like with each pandemic, you either had two options, two historical trajectories from your examples. Most of it seemed like reforming current institutions, but also building out institutions. So given that we're in a post-pandemic reality, or a pandemic reality, I'm just curious, do you kind of see this as a moment of trying to figure out how medical education can foster a solidarity that expands beyond the social good of health, which itself has been where most of the energy has been dedicated? Or do you think that what we're seeing is just a failure of other institutions to actually foster solidarity in a way that kind of enables medicine to kind of play its role, maybe as a subsidian, but not overtake it? Is that, I don't know if I'm being clear.
You're being very clear. I appreciate the question. I don't know the answer. I guess what I'm trying to make an argument for is that it's not just medicine, but it's the idea of the research university in general has not been in sufficient solidarity with its community and hasn't paid enough attention to the common good. I don't know that many of the universities that I speak at and visit and talk to, I think that they're trying to figure out how to do what they were doing 5 years ago and haven't yet wrestled with, I think, what is an existential change. And that's, I may be wrong, but I believe we're entering into a very different era. And I may be wrong, but if you look at Lutimer's papers, and you look at a map of Duke in 1940 versus now, it's a very different university because of the partnership with the federal government. And if you read Lutimer and other historians of the university, what they say is that in World War II, the American government realizes that it's sending a lot of its research to the Army and the armed forces, and that in fact the research university can do it faster and better. And that keeps growing. I wasn't for the young people in the room, I was not alive during World War II. But if you look at a map of what Central North Carolina looked like in 1942, it's a very different place. Yeah, and that's because of the research universities, right? This place is different. I love where I live in Colorado, but Dr. Thorpe made a comment about how there wasn't a lot of research in Denver. He's not right. He's not wrong. Like, Denver has not grown in the same way that this area has. When I'm in North Carolina, I'm astounded by how there's people from all over the world, and you sit in a cafe in this town, and there's crazy smart people talking about awesome stuff. You know, like Ryan and I had dinner the other night, Till and I had dinner the other night, and people were talking about economics lectures, and it was like 3 super smart people talking about economics. Like, that was not what was happening here before. I don't know that that's going to keep happening, right? Research universities are changing in relation to the federal government. Sorry. Ed Dark. Yes, please.
With a country like the U.S. that's super pluralistic, and there's lots of folks who are a part of religious institutions, but a lot who are not. What could be potential kind of ways that we improve on subsidiarity? Like, what types of institutions, local, is it like community health centers or religious institutions, or like what are the types of social institutions at a more local level that can be utilized for increasing subsidiarity in the U.S.?
Thanks for asking. Love it. Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. I'm recommending that you probably go join a Catholic church, right? I recommend that you get involved in your kids' school, right? So part of what I had is very different experiences of my kids were at different schools, and they responded differently, and there one kind of appreciated subsidiary and one did not. And you should lean in there where you can, right? Build out the place where you live, wherever you wind up, and love it. And meet some people who are different than you. One of the things I love about my job is that every day I meet people who are different than me. I recognize that I'm deeply in a hierarchical or power relationship because I'm their physician. But it's a great gift of my life that I get to meet people who are different than me. And I've stayed in one place for a long time trying to build out and love that place, right? And that's pretty awesome. Dr. Kinghorn? Or, I'm sorry, in the back. Maybe you were first, I don't know.
After you. Thank you. Thank you, Abraham. This is, I think, implicit in some of what you've already said, but I wonder if you might comment on it more. I'm not sure that I agree that the pandemic response was not oriented toward the common good, but I would agree that the vision of the common good that was put forward by like CDC and a lot of our officials was more, it was like too narrowly focused on the common good of like bodily health and freedom from infection. And it didn't take into account other proper human goods like work and social connection and play and worship and the kinds of things that don't go into epidemiological curves. Yeah, and so I just wonder if that might tie to the Catholic social teaching tradition where to think about solidarity and to think about the common good actually requires a deep account of the dignity of the human person that involves the human good as being more than bodily health. And I wonder if you could just comment on that.
I agree with everything you just said, and I appreciate the clarification. I chose not to speak about the dignity of the human person because I feel like people know and think about that one more commonly. But many people would say that's the core of all Catholic social teaching, right? I chose to speak about solidarity and subsidiarity because I think that they're not thought of as often. But you're absolutely right. So I guess I would just say I totally agree with you that part of what I would say is to be human and to be fully human is to do all these other things. To work, to play, to love, to worship, right? To study. And it is an awesome thing to not die, right? But it is not a definition of life to not be dead. Does that make sense? To be alive is to do those other things. And we need to account for those. It matters a ton that we didn't overwhelm the hospital system in Denver. I'm grateful for that. But it also matters that we shut down the schools when we shouldn't have for too long, right? And prayers worship. So I think there's a question.
Rohit, last question.
Yes, Doctor, thanks for being here. I'm also an alum of the Denver Catholic Schools Athletic League. So I got to give
school?
Nativity. So I got to give a shout out to the Nativity
shout out
Knights.
Nativity. That's amazing. You're all the way from Nativity. That's great.
Just one of my stops. I actually finished high school in relatively rural Alabama, and my wife is from a small farm town in Iowa, and that's tied to my question. There's kind of a joke in those areas that COVID didn't really happen here, or like COVID, like we didn't follow any of that. And to your point, there's been this polarization where rural, I think the big split in America today is rural to metro, rural areas versus metro areas. And your pitch too, like in these communities, no one has deep ties to a research university or even a doctor. A lot of these places are just PA running the local clinic or something like that. So I think the pitch from or the reaction from a lot of these people, which I've heard firsthand, is why should I listen to Dr. So and so, especially after a few months had happened, not that initial summer. They're like, why should I listen to some far off authority who doesn't care about me, is from an institution that has nothing to do with me, that excludes me to some degree, whether that's perceived or not, and kind of chose to eschew intentionally, just as kind of as kind of a rebellious act. And like, how do you change that in the future, where people don't necessarily in these areas, especially rural areas, don't see why they should listen to someone from a far off institution they find exclusive?
So I appreciate the question, and shout out Nativity. We beat you this year.
Not the year I was there.
Not that year I was there. Melissa Sacker, we beat Nativity. We'll see him in the playoffs next week, probably. Look, I guess I'm never going to agree with the statement that I shouldn't listen to someone just because they're from far away, right? Like, I think the world's a fascinating place, and adopting a stance of curiosity to somebody, even though if they're from afar, is the right way to be. That being said, I talked a lot about medicine because that's what I know best, but it is the case that we have disproportionately distributed those resources. And the classic example, right, is to say, a lot of these people are saying, hey, look, our smartest kids leave and go to a research university and don't come back. And that's fair. That's a fair statement. It's a fair statement to say, if you think about why we fund resident education, that's through the Medicare tax dollars of everybody who gets a paycheck. And there's a gigantic disproportionate share of where those things go. And if everybody's going to pay into Medicare, that's a question of solidarity, then some of those training for physicians should be in Iowa, and in rural Iowa, and even rural Alabama, and even a Nativity school. And that's a fair statement. And I would say I agree with folks about that, is that we haven't done a good job of distributing all of the goods of this stuff throughout the United States. And that's part of how you can pull money from research universities, is when you look at election maps like that. I think it's one of the things I love about North Carolina, and the glorious land has been so good to me, and I'm so grateful for it, is this is a state where there's a university or college in almost every town. You can't drive an hour in North Carolina and not find a university or college. That's amazing. That's not true in my state. In Colorado, that's not the case. And so I wish more states would do what North Carolina did historically, of spread those colleges out, right? I think it helps. But I guess I'd say to somebody, I'm sorry, I wish we would do better as medicine, right? I hear that part of it, but I also want to listen to people, even if they're from somewhere else. I guess that's what I'd say. Thanks for coming. Appreciate everybody.
So on that note, before we conclude, just one quick word from our sponsor. 12 days from today, we'll be having another distinguished lecture. Father Thomas Joseph White, the distinguished theologian and rector of the Angelicum University in Rome, will speak on how can one say that God has become human. But now the last thing that we have to do is to thank our speaker, Dr. Nussbaum, for this very fascinating and productive